You must be as happy as I am to be here this morning and to also continue our study through the book of Exodus. And to our visitors here, we've been doing this for a few months now, and we have finally landed in the plagues. We've taken 5 months to get to chapter 7, and the scripture reading this morning should have been familiar to you because that's what we had last Sunday. And we walked through how God has delivered his words and how he's going to do the sign. And now we are getting into the wonders and judgment. And so we are finally in the wonders and the judgment in the plagues of Egypt. And so this morning we're going to be going through a lot of chapters, but not reading through all of them. Here at Monterey Peninsula, we like to take about a month per chapter. But today we're going to go from 7 to 11 in the span of maybe less than an hour, I hope. There's a lot here, but I think I want for us to really focus on what God is trying to communicate in these plagues, and that is who he is, his identity. The identity of God is revealed in the plagues to Pharaoh, to Israel, to all of Egypt, and naturally to us as we read about this God. And you understand that identity is revealed in how somebody shows themselves. God is showing himself and who he is, and so that's how he's revealing his identity. And you kind of do the same thing for yourself, right? Like, where does your identity come from? Where does your identity come from? You think like, okay, well, I identify based on where I was born. And so I am a Burqueño because I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I closely identify with that, both the good and the bad. I feel like I can't tell somebody I'm from Albuquerque without them asking me if I've watched Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul or something. Or you might identify yourself based on your career, right? Like I'm a graphic designer, and so you closely associate who you are with being a graphic designer or an interior designer. Why am I only thinking of designers? Anything else? A preacher. You know, I'm a preacher, and you say the I am as though that is part of who you are and how you're going to be associated. And naturally, you associate yourself by what's been nurtured upon you with your family. You are carrying this last name, or your guardians have raised you to be this way. And so your identity, the way you portray yourself, is how you've been raised and what you've learned, right? And so identity, you know, is what we reveal about ourselves and what people associate with us. It's the picture that they paint of us when they think about us. They think of everything that encompasses us, from our characteristics, the way we walk, talk, the way we present ourselves, you know. And so God here, in the plagues of Egypt, is identifying who he is. And we are going to look at the identity of God and how he is revealing himself in these plagues. And so if you look at all of these, you will see a consistent pattern in chapter 7 to 11 that God is trying to get the point across of who he is, and he's not shy about it. In fact, he's very direct with it. He says over and over, you will know I am the Lord. God is almost painting like the bottom line to a whole sermon here. This is what you're going to get at the end of all of this, Egypt. I am the Lord. This is who I am. And you will know it based on everything that you experience here. You will know that I am the Lord. And this part of his identity that he is revealing is challenging all of the identity of Egypt, since they have multiple gods. You know Egypt is polytheistic. They've got the sun god, they've got the frog god, they've got all of the gods for the rivers and for the flies to drive things out. They've got the crop god. And then Pharaoh would also count himself as one of the gods. Pharaoh, the king, has always seen himself as deity and will pass into the afterlife, into in Egyptian folklore, and they will essentially be welcomed as a god there, and they will be the ancestor that directs the future ancestors. And God is saying, I am not one of these gods. I am none of these gods. In fact, none of these gods can stand up to who I am. And the way that God shows that is he crushes everything that these gods would rule over. And you see this in every single plague, right? As we go through the plagues, you have in chapter 7, the latter part of chapter 7, you have the water that's turned to blood. And so The Nile was the source of Egypt's power, as we see in this little box here. There's several gods that are associated with the river. There's Kahun, the guardian of the rivers, Source, Hapi, the lord of the fish, Osiris, the Nile, was his bloodstream, right? And so God, turning the water into blood, is saying, I'm not this God, and not only am I not this God, but this God does not exist. This God cannot measure up to who I am, and so I am not your local God. Same with the frog God. God, since the plague of the frogs, you thought Heket was the goddess. Nope, Heket does not exist, and Heket will never measure up to me. You will know that I am the Lord because I send you frogs, and you cannot drive frogs away. And you see the same thing with the gnats and the lice. You can't drive these away by the name of your God. That God does not exist. You will know that I am the Lord, the one and only God, and so on with the flies and with the plague of the cattle. And through all 10 of these plagues, God is challenging and defeating the false gods of Egypt. All the way down to number 10, the death of the firstborn. Pharaoh, you thought you were a god? You thought you had the righteous authority for infant genocide. I saw that, and I condemn it. And you will know that I am the Lord, and you are wrong. All the way down to the man that sees himself as a god, God is saying, you are not in control. But through all of this, you will know that I am the Lord. You will know me. Furthermore, God reveals this to Pharaoh over and over and over again, not just in the signs of the plagues, but by word of mouth. He tells Aaron, go tell him who I am. Exodus 7:17, it's spoken to Pharaoh, you will know that I am the Lord God. Moses tells it to Pharaoh when Pharaoh finally calls Moses to intercede for him after all of these frogs have come upon them. And Moses says, well, then you shall know that he is the Lord when all of these things go away. You will know, same thing in 22. You will know that I am the Lord. 9:14, you will know that I am the Lord. Furthermore, the world will know. In Exodus 9:16, God is giving this announcement of the hail that's coming upon Egypt. And God is giving this grand dialogue through the mouth of Moses and Aaron and telling him not just what's going to happen, but is giving them the opportunity to get out of this. And then God reveals the bigger plan. I am raising you up for this situation, Pharaoh. And through all of this that you are experiencing here, the whole world will know that I am the Lord. In verse 15, it says this of chapter 9, for by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. But for this purpose I have raised you up to show you my power, so that my name be proclaimed in all the earth. This isn't just for you, Egypt. This is for the whole world to know. And this isn't just for the whole world to know. This is for Israel to even know. In 10:2 it says, you are going to teach this, what's happened here, to the generation after you, and the generation after that, and the generation after that, and the generation after that, so that Israel knows that I am the Lord. And they will remember this. And so by the end of all of this, everybody knows that God is the Lord. And not just that, God isn't coming in here and just doing what he is doing to be a bully to Egypt. He's not doing it just because he doesn't like Egypt or approve it. He is also showing, I am faithful to my covenant. I have established my covenant with Israel, and I am holding to that. As powerful as you are, Egypt, you do not have my blessing. I'm not changing sides. I have made Israel my covenant. And I will hold fast to that. And by doing that, there is a distinction between who I am faithful to and who I am against. Those that oppress who I am for, you will see my signs and wonders and judgment. And so God defines the barrier between Israel and Egypt, where Israel does not experience total darkness, but Egypt does. Israel does not experience the flies, Egypt does. And so on and so on. You'll know that I am faithful and true to what I have said. Egypt will know it. Israel will know it. The whole world will know it. And hopefully, you know it also. And you will know that I am merciful. In all of this, how can God be merciful in bringing on all all of these wonders and judgment? How has God shown that he is merciful in all of these acts? He has consistently given them the option before the wonder happens for them to humble themselves and say, yes, Lord, you are the Lord. And we will let Israel go. He gives them at least 24 hours notice, saying, you have the opportunity to change, but the standard is still there that I will bring my wonder. What are you going to do? You even get to the hail again, and God gives them ample warning and opportunity to bring in their livestock so that they don't get killed by the hail. In verse 19 of chapter 9, Moses is announcing this plague that's coming. Now therefore send, get your livestock and all that you have in the field into safe shelter. For every man and beast that is in the field and is not brought home will die when hail falls on them. Those were words to Egypt. You have the opportunity here to get out of this. Verse 20, then whoever feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh hurried his slaves and his livestock into the houses. But whoever did not pay attention to the word of the Lord left his slaves and his livestock in the field. And God was giving them the opportunity not just to prepare for what was coming, but to get out of it and to come to him. And so God can be presented as the all-powerful, righteous God, the one that is also faithful and true to his covenant, and also the one that is still merciful to those that he sets his face against. You see, God will be identified as he truly is, not as he's made out to be. Not as a false God. Not as who people want him to be, but God says, this is who I am. I truly am that I am. And he will be represented by his people as he truly is. And since God has presented all of this, and all of this is set forth before both Egypt and Israel, the question is for us, how do you respond to God sending these wonders and these signs and these opportunities? How do you respond to God doing all of these plagues? Do you respond like Moses, or do you respond like Pharaoh? That's your question this morning. And I know you're thinking, well, obviously I respond like Moses, because Moses is the good guy. Moses is the example. Moses is the one that's called by God. I clearly respond like Moses responds because I'm in church this morning, right? But when we set up this comparison, if you don't respond so much like Moses, you have the opportunity to observe that you might respond like Pharaoh and then want to start responding like Moses responds, right? So let's make the comparison here. When God presents himself in all of his power and all of his identity, do you respond like Pharaoh or like Moses? Because you see, through all of this time, this is how Pharaoh responds. There's about 3 different ways, and they're not even that different. They all kind of blend together. Pharaoh responds in one way where he first is dismissive of the message that's brought to him. And then that dismissal will eventually have to turn into his pleading to Moses and saying, get God to relieve us of this. And then he will start bargaining and saying, okay, what God is telling you to do, Moses, you can have part of that, but not all of that. And then it turns right back into dismissal. Well, if it's not going to be on my terms, then I don't want any part of it. And in all of that, Pharaoh will also have times where once he is convicted and confronted with who he is and the wrong that he has done, he will first confess, but there will be no change in his life. He can confess and say he is wrong. He can even say, I have sinned, but he will not move to repentance. And he can also make observations all around him of what God is bringing on the land, and that does not spark any desire for change in himself, but actually it convinces him to just be even more angry with God, more undesiring of God's people. So how does Pharaoh dismiss, plead, bargain, and dismiss? You see it over and over. The first dismissal comes after the sign that's presented to him when Aaron puts out a staff and it becomes a serpent. In Exodus chapter 7, This is Pharaoh's response. Exodus 7:13. Still Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord said. I just don't want to hear it. I just don't want to hear it. I don't want to see it. I don't want to be defeated. I don't care. That happens. You get to the water turning to blood on the Nile, and after Pharaoh observes it, calls his Egyptian magicians to come in and say, the God of the Hebrews has turned the water into blood. You know what we need? We need more water into blood. You got to do this. And so his magicians make Kool-Aid or whatever it is. And Pharaoh's response to this is he just goes inside. Dismissive. I don't care. Goes inside. You get to the frogs, and there's frogs jumping on everybody and out of everything and into everything. There's frogs everywhere. And Pharaoh says, magicians, we've got a lot of frogs in the land. You know what we need? More frogs. And so his magicians bring in more frogs. But it is so bad, it's so bad, that Pharaoh finally breaks and he moves from dismissive to going to Moses and saying, plead to God, your God, just take away the frogs. Get the frogs out of here, Moses. Exodus chapter 8, verse 8. Then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, plead with the Lord to take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. Verse 15. But when Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, that's like a relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them, as the Lord said. Once relief came, it was like, I guess it's not really a problem anymore. And this will be the pattern from pleading. And then when it continues with the rest of the wonders, Pharaoh will eventually call in Moses and try to make a negotiation with him. I know that God has said that all of you have to go 3 days into the wilderness to hold this feast and make a sacrifice, but what if just the guys go? Just leave the wives, the children, the livestock. Guys trip into the wilderness. And Moses says, that's not what God said to do. Okay, well, what if you just leave the kids here? Like, parent vacation into the wilderness to worship God. Just leave the kids at home. They don't need to go to church with you. Just go into the wilderness. And Moses says, no, the kids are coming too. This is what God has said. Okay, just leave the animals. Leave the pets at home. Nope, the pets are coming with us. We got to hold a feast, and we don't know what God is going to tell us what we're going to need until we get to the wilderness. There is no room for compromise. And since Pharaoh can't win this bargain, the negotiation on his terms, it turns back into dismissal. Just get out of my face, Moses and Aaron, and I will not let you leave. First, Pharaoh's confronted with the issue, which calls for change, and he dismisses what God is calling him to do. That dismissal might move into a pleading, okay, yes, I get it, God. But then it just moves into bargaining. Well, God, I don't want to change that much. I don't want to let go of that much, even though it might be wrong. 2, you know what? I don't want anything to do with you, God. I don't want anything to do with this. In essence, since Pharaoh is not getting his way against the Lord, he will still see himself as just the God that is in control of himself. I am still God of me and of my people. In other places, throughout all of these wonders that are being exercised, Pharaoh can also recognize, I have sinned. I have done wrong. I said that I would let you go, and then I didn't let you go, and that's on me, Moses. That's on me, God. God, you were right, and I was wrong. But even though Pharaoh can confess that he has sinned against God, he still refuses to change and not follow through on his word. He can confess and recognize a wrong, but he has no desire to continue and to move into the right when confronted with what he is doing wrong. And then all of his observations of what God is doing hardens his heart. When God says, I am the Lord. When God says, you have an opportunity to be out of this. When God says, I am faithful to my covenant over here, all of that to Pharaoh gives him reason to observe and harden his heart against God. And say, I don't approve of it. And so when it comes to the identity of God and what God offers and calls us to do, can you relate to Pharaoh? Can you relate to Pharaoh when God is directly confronting you with sin? That doesn't apply to me. That's too much for me. Well, God, what if we just have a negotiation here? If it doesn't hurt people that I see, then it's not sin, God. It doesn't apply to me. God, you want me to change, but I don't want to change. You want me to give some things up, but I don't want to give those things up. I'm still God of my life. I don't need you anyway. Is that something that you relate with? Or can you relate to even recognizing that there's a wrong in your life and even calling it sin, but have no desire or motive to repent of it? To move away from the sin? To make any sort of change? And say, I don't want this to continue to happen. Or can you call it sin and say, but you know what? I don't mind doing it again. And does your observation of God working justice and holding those who are wrong accountable, but rewarding those that are in his covenant, you have those that are blessed and those that will be cast away from God, does that observation move you away from God? Does that observation harden your heart towards God and think it's not right that God holds all of the power to be able to do this? Because that is what Pharaoh was like. You know, we might actually relate a little bit more to Pharaoh than we do to Moses. Because here's how Moses is. You know, Moses was the one that Pharaoh would run to when there was a problem. And Moses' attitude as he experiences all of the dismissal and the rejection of Pharaoh, Moses' attitude was, Pharaoh, I want to intercede for you. I want to go talk to God and plead your case. Back in the frog plague, Exodus 8:8, then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, plead with the Lord to take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go sacrifice to the Lord. Moses said to Pharaoh, be pleased to command me when I am to plead for you, for your servants and for your people, that the frogs may be cut off from your houses and be left only in the Nile. Pharaoh, be pleased to command me to go plead your case. I am more than happy to do that for you, Pharaoh. You're under God's judgment, and you have a really big frog problem. I am more than happy to go to the same God that is exercising this wonder over you and to plead your case. I have delivered the word of truth to you, Pharaoh, without compromise. This is God's term, and now that you are seeing that, I am happy to intercede and plead your case. Is that you? You see people all around that are under the wrath of God, and there's coming a day when that will be executed in its fullness. Are you pleased to pray for those people? Are you pleased to go and tell those people and deliver them the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and then go to God and say, God, they're under your wrath? Moses' observation of everything that God is doing does not move him to harden his heart, but actually to be more steadfast in God also. He observes there's a distinction between those that are under the covenant and those that are under judgment. And because of that, I want to remain fully with the people that are under steadfast covenant. You see this transformation come about. Moses pretty much has a total transformation from the beginning of his life to this point now, right? Where did we pick Moses up? Moses was out in the field as a shepherd, his father-in-law's sheep, married, and he didn't care so much even to the point of God's covenant. He didn't care so much even to the point that he was just going to stop the sign of covenant by not circumcising his children anymore. It was like he was like completely removing his identity almost from Israel altogether. This is where we picked up Moses. Moses is kind of dragging his feet to Egypt, and he wants God to send somebody else. And then in that first presentation in the court of Pharaoh, Moses and Aaron both kind of stumble over their words. So you see their attitude in this is no confidence whatsoever. Where's Moses now? Moses is now the one, as we read in Exodus chapter 7 in these first few verses. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded them to do. You went from insecurity to total obedience. The more time that Moses spends with God, the more dedicated Moses is to God. The more that Moses observes what God is doing, the more transformation Moses sees to further represent God. You remember how after Pharaoh took away straw from the Israelites, and so their burden was even greater. And the response of Israel from that additional burden to Moses and Aaron was, God judge you, Moses and Aaron, for putting this burden on us because you have made us a stink in the land. You've made our situation worse. And Moses turns to God and says, God, what have you done? What did you do to me? What did you do to all these people? And Moses was not respected whatsoever. But then there's this transformation as Moses spends more time with God in Exodus chapter 11, verse 3. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of his people. You see, Moses had an all-around transformation, spending more time with God. Can you relate to this instead? Rather than Pharaoh, is it your desire and obligation to deliver uncompromising words of God and then to intercede for people that are under God's judgment and hope that they will plead, bring me to God? Does your observation of what God does make you more steadfast in his covenant? Does your observation and experience with God transform you to be closer to God rather than push yourself away from God? So who do you identify more with, Moses or Pharaoh? And if you identify more with Pharaoh, how are you going to start identifying more with Moses? Because greater than Moses, if you can capture this, greater than Moses is Jesus Christ. And this is made clear. In all that Moses did, how much more did Jesus Christ do? Hebrews chapter 3, verse 3 says this, For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses. As much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to things that were to be spoken later, but Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. And we are his house if, indeed, we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. Greater than Moses is Jesus Christ, who offers more. If Jesus Christ is greater than Moses, then consider all the acts that determine that Jesus is greater than Moses. Even in Jesus' teaching on mercy and forgiveness in Matthew chapter 18, verse 21, Jesus teaches this. Then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. There's more forgiveness. And God's people will identify the mercy and the forgiveness of God, of Jesus Christ. And this can carry on, you see, in Romans chapter 5, verse 6, For while we were weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one might even dare to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Greater than Moses is Jesus Christ, who will die himself for sinners and plead the case for sinners. Paul will write in in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." You want to be like Jesus? Be like his sacrifice. Be like his forgiving. Be like his mercy. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 33, "Just as I try to please everyone in everything, I do not seek my own advantage, but that of the many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ." You see what I'm doing, says Paul? What I'm doing is trying to be like Christ. You want to be like me? Be like Christ. Be like Christ, who would sacrifice it all for the sinner. Be like Christ, who would intercede for the sinner. Be like Christ, who pleads the case for the sinner. Be like Christ, who delivers the message in fullness to the sinner, that they might come out from judgment and into salvation as a co-heir and as a son of God. Greater than Moses is being like Christ. You see, in all of this, God can work his wonders in his judgment, and he is just to do so. He did it in Exodus. He will do it at the end of time. We can revere God's wonders in judgment, and we should. We can revere God's wonders and judgment and still intercede and plead for others under God's righteous judgment. You can do both. You can revere it and hope that others come out from under it. And you can do all of that and still remain steadfast and uncompromising to our commitment with God. In fact, this is exactly what we should do, because not only does Moses teach us this, but this is exactly what Jesus Christ teaches us to do. And God will be identified as he truly is and presented as he truly is by his people. Are you that people? Are you that people? Do you accurately represent who God is? Who do you pray to God for and say, "Lord, this person does not know you, and I want to deliver uncompromising truth to them. And I am praying that they will come out from under your judgment." Are you like Moses? Are you like God's people? Who are you doing that for? Or who will you start doing that for? Because Jesus Christ did that for you. And if you represent Jesus Christ, this will be your task too. The lesson is yours this morning. If there's any way that I can help you, you can see me in the back as we sing this invitation song, "I Am Resolved," number 325.